everyone. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Texas Insider TV, brought to you by Speedstream. I'm Jim Cardle. He's chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee in the middle of a legislative session that's focused on tax reform and improving the Texas competitive state nationally. Harvey Hillderbran's our guest today for Texas Insider TV. Harvey, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
As I've mentioned, we're in the middle of the session. You have had an active committee schedule, continuing to get more active. I know the margins tax and tax reform in general are front and center. Tell us, if you can, what you're working on and what you see as some of the priorities.
Absolutely. We're working on reforming the entire tax code where we can, but with a special focus on reforming the business franchise tax, better known as the margins tax. And what we're working on is trying to make it a fairer, simpler program, a fairer, simpler tax where all businesses are treated the same instead of some businesses receiving favorable treatment by having a certain deduction available to them that a very similar class of business does not have available. And so it becomes a competitive disadvantage if you're the other business that doesn't get the same treatment. So we want to make it more uniform. We want to make it consistent and make sure that a cost of goods deduction applies to the entire industry segment instead of some businesses within that segment. Give you a couple examples.
Okay.
Automotive repair shop.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an independent automotive repair shop, you don't get the deduction and you pay more in taxes, margins tax, than if you're a part of a dealership or a parts store, a parts department with your auto. So if you go out and get the parts at a parts store, you don't qualify with one that does. And if you're an automobile dealer who sells and also services, you get treated better with more favorable deductions and exemptions than if you're independent, doesn't have those things.
And you've been on the record listing examples like that. That's one of the primary considerations that you're looking at. There's inequities throughout this that are only now visible after a couple of years of
right.
being implemented.
There are other examples. Oil and gas landmen who hire subcontractors to finish a big project that they've won the award of a contract with, say, a large a petroleum company, and they're going to go and look at the records, find out who owns the royalty interest, and then basically bring that data to their client so they can contract with them for oil and gas exploration. Well, if you're a landman and you've got a big project that you can't, with the number of employees, number of people you have on your staff, can't get that job done within the time limit that you've been given, you would sub out to other firms to bring in enough people to get the job done. Well, that you couldn't deduct that. So if you got paid X from the company that hired you, and you paid out Y to these companies, these subcontractors, to help you get the job done, you would get taxed on all of it as if all of it was received by you and retained by that first company, and not get to deduct the part that was subbed out. So you're taxed on 100%, even though you only got to keep 40%.
So there's two good examples. You've essentially got a tiger by the tail at this point as chairman of Ways and Means. One other thing, if I can drill down specifically, that you've been talking about a little bit, and that is the $1 million threshold.
Yeah,
what's the outlook for that?
Okay, well, we're going to pass. I've got a bill I introduced to preserve and make permanent the small business exemption in the franchise tax, which is for businesses that gross $1 million or less. They get to basically check the return to say that they're not required to file, which basically gives them an exemption. But all they do is do the report and check that box. But anybody making grossing $1 more than $1 million does not get that benefit. And
it's always a problem.
So it's $1 million or less. You don't get the benefit of the $1 million deduction if you make 1.5 million gross. So we're looking at a standard deduction. We'll hear that next Monday, of $1 million standard deduction up to $20 million. There's one that doesn't have a $20 million cap. There's also the easy form. It's not really utilized by a lot of businesses, but it's supposed to be a very simple form that if they use it, they wouldn't have to go to an accountant if they didn't want to.
So in that particular instance, if I may, again, folks, we're visiting with Harvey Hillderbran from Kerrville, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee here in Texas. Specifically, you've said, though, that you're in favor of repealing the margins tax, and you've listed a couple examples,
Yeah.
but it's problematic because you're talking
yeah.
about losing money here
Right.
or gaining money
I voted
there.
against the margins tax when it first passed.
Okay.
But when it did pass, the idea was to, and there were things I liked about it, the things I didn't like about it. Mainly, I didn't like how it treated small business. I didn't like some of the other inequities and things that we're trying to fix now. But we also basically transferred a significant portion of the local property tax burden to fund public schools. And even though that failed because there was not an appraisal cap or appraisal reform where you could slow down the growth in appraisals, people don't remember that in 2007 they got about a few $100s in property tax relief, and the next year it was a little less, but still a little bit of relief. But then it was fleeting, and it basically they don't recall. They don't recall it, even though it does slow down the growth. It did slow down the growth in property taxes. The bottom line is people don't feel like they got tax relief.
Okay.
But that was the policy passed. I voted against that bill. But what we have now is a property tax relief fund that was created, that the margins tax proceeds, the revenue raised by the margins tax goes into that fund to offset what used to be funded by the local property tax.
So
there's still a local property tax still funding public schools, but there used to be a greater share of it. Part of that share was taken on by the state, and now it's funded by the property tax relief fund, which receives its revenue from the margins tax. So there's over a $5 billion amount of money that goes in there. Well, what happens is we've got to basically, if we are able to repeal the margins tax, which would be a very popular idea and something that I support conceptually, something that I would love for us to do.
NFIB and other groups.
But to be responsible, you've got to replace that $5+ billion with another revenue source. Or if you phased it out, which is something I'm looking at, and there's a couple of ways to do that, you would have to prove up that if you didn't replace the source with a new source of revenue, you'd have to prove that the economy would grow fast enough and faster than it otherwise would grow. So new growth that would be as a result of getting rid of the margins tax or phasing it out, you would have $1.5 billion growth of biennium outside of what we would have gotten anyway and what we're projected to get to replace that money. And you can't just say on theory or on paper would do it. You couldn't. You'd have a $5 billion hole in public schools, public education. So you've got to prove that up before you can pass a bill that would repeal it or phase it out. I am desperately seeking that information. I've requested from the Texas Public Policy Foundation. They were going to do a survey.
I know you're working with the comptroller's office.
Working with the comptroller's office, working with other conservative groups and conservative physical policy groups to try to get that information. There's been some polls done showing it'd be very popular to repeal it. Obviously, I didn't need a poll to tell me that. I know that it'd be very popular to repeal it. I'd like to do that, but you've got to be responsible and work within the facts, and you've got to either replace it with another source or prove up that the economy will grow as a result of that policy change fast enough that revenue would be replaced with growth. Now, that brings me to growth in general. That's what's behind all these things. The margins tax reform we're doing would give tax relief and cut taxes to anyone that received a more favorable treatment today under a new bill than they do today. And the same thing with increasing the exemptions, all the different things we're looking at to not only reform the tax and make it fair and simpler, but also to give relief, which means tax cut.
Okay.
And that will grow the economy because small business will invest.
Okay, Chairman, if I can, because we're running out of time, and going to have you back later for part 2 of this informative interview, which we greatly appreciate. So, cutting to the bottom line, you're looking from 1 to 10, at 10 being total repeal, 1 leaving everything where it is. Are you going to get halfway toward where you think you want to get?
I think we're going to get it at the minimum more than halfway. I think we're probably going to be around 7. And maybe more. I mean, my hope is to get as close to 10 as we can, but we've got to prove up those numbers. But we've got to create an environment, make it fair, but also have businesses then expand their businesses, invest more, hire more people, and grow the economy, which will grow the revenue the state needs to support this growing population of Texas.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there for part one of our two-part interview with House Ways and Means Chairman Harvey Hillderbran. Chairman, thanks for coming by and your
You're welcome.
hard
My
work
pleasure.
over there. Folks, be sure to tune back in for another edition of Texas Insider TV with Chairman Harvey Hillderbran. Remember, you're either an insider or you're not. I'm Jim Cardle. Excellent.
So do you think I covered that whole conservative thing?